Go ahead and state your name for the record again.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Rachel Hammond. I'm the Executive Director for the Texas Association for Homecare and Hospice, and it's been very interesting discussion. And so I'd really like to comment on some of the things that Dr. Zerwas was saying and Mr. Fallon was also talking about as well, related to some of the issues and concerns, because I think it's a great conversation. What we're finding, because there's been a lot of questions, what is the data? There is a difference between fraud and what's an error. And there's been some questions, well, kind of what's the data on that? Well, we can give you examples. I can tell you that a provider went through an audit, 0 findings, but it took the OIG 5 years to close it. 5 years, 0 findings. I can tell you that there are providers currently going through audits right now. And what's considered an error, well, I can give you some examples. An error can be, well, you forgot to put the Medicaid beneficiary's name on every single page of your Medicaid record. They take money back for that. Okay, you provided the service, you documented the service, but the money goes back. Okay, so that's an error. All right, and then other issues about policy. What we're finding is that there are certain programs where Medicaid policy is being misapplied. So a provider is audited for a particular service, and in this case I gave you an example in the testimony related to the personal care services program. It's a non-medical program that switched from DADS over to HHSC in 2007. And so I gave you an example as to an application or a misapplication of the policy that's currently going on right now, secondary to an OIG audit. And so when providers get that letter that we're taking money back, and the letter says, hey, we're applying this policy this way, even though they're following the Medicaid policy correctly, it's concerning. And so what's the solution to that? I think that there is the ability for the OIG to participate in more of the policy development with HHSC and the stakeholders. You always talk about what is the root cause to these issues. I can tell you back in 2007 when the PCS program switched from DADS over to HHSC, I worked very closely with HHSC on the policy development for that non-medical program. Not one person from the OIG was in the room when that policy was being developed. And during policy development, you talk about, well, how is this going to be implemented? What does it look like? What is non-medical versus medical? How do we apply medical necessity? When does that happen? That happens in PCS at the assessment level. And so all of those things are discussed during that policy development. And if the OIG is going to come back 5-6 years later and try and apply policy, I think it would be a great idea when we have stakeholder meetings and HHSC is in the middle of developing policy that providers have to comply with, and then representatives from the OIG can be in the room. I think that would be extremely helpful in understanding how to apply Medicaid policy to particular programs. I know they've done a lot in terms of hiring more FTEs that are clinically based FTEs so that they understand how to apply Medicaid policy, but where does it start? It starts at the development. So, and I don't think that takes a lot more FTEs to do that. I think that that's something that they can work with the OIG or with HHSC on. So, we do have data on, errors, and I do think, to your point, Dr. Zerwas, there really does need to be a very clear distinction on what is truly an error. And let me tell you, errors can be as simple as not putting a Medicaid patient's name and number on every single piece of paper. Or we have examples where a nurse might have struck through a piece of documentation and initialed and forgot to date it. That's an error. And so, there are things that could be considered errors that are recoupable, but that money is not fraud and abuse. So in order to allocate resources appropriately, you have to know what you're dealing with. And so to allocate resources toward fraud and abuse, allocate those resources truly toward fraud and abuse, and then understand what are truly errors. And do we truly need to extrapolate or apply the same extrapolation process to errors such as those versus fraud and abuse? So those are some things I think to consider, and I really appreciate very candid discussion.
Good suggestion.
Mr. Chairman, a quick question, if Doug can answer it. Do you all have discretion, or do you have to go by letter of the law? So, for instance, you find an error that's rather minor, and do you, by statute, just have to press forward on it?
So, okay, this is the first. There is some level of discretion. So generally what I tell my staff is if it's a close call, tie goes to the provider. We're not trying to be petty about these things. Her comment regarding my staff knowing policy or not knowing policy, my take on that has absolutely been with my staff. We're only enforcing the program requirements, nothing more. So if there's a question, we call it one way, the provider calls another. We bring the program staff close to us, and dads, whatever the agency is, to make sure we're interpreting it the right way. I mean, we've been doing that now for a while. And the program either validates, you're calling this right or you're calling it wrong. If we're wrong, we back off. So I like to see her example. That would help me better categorize it. But I could, even with dads particularly, we could show examples where we actually, I marry my people up with them and tell my nurses if we're calling it left and they say it's right, it's their program. We only enforce the program. So with regard to whatever the error is, we have some level of discretion, but I try to point out to my staff and even to providers, I do more than just Medicaid fraud. As you guys know, I do SNAP fraud. Those people are coming in some cases, I pursue fraud and I pursue non-fraud. I'll pursue agency error, i.e. Doug Wilson comes in and says, I'll make $1,000 a month. The person puts, I'll make $500. An overpayment occurs. We don't discover the overpayment for 6 months or a year. I'm on the hook as a SNAP recipient for every dollar I got paid over what I was entitled to, and I did nothing wrong. The agency made the error. We have those guys pay that money back. So suggesting to me or to the office that a provider who, and I get it, some of these are just errors, but it leads to an overpayment. I don't have discretion for the feds, and it concerns me a little bit if we're saying, if I can prove that it's criminal, I would extrapolate on the criminals, but I wouldn't extrapolate on non-criminals that have been overpaid dollars they're not entitled to. From the feds coming and looking at me, that would be interestingly viewed, I think, and that would be difficult for me even to defend. However, this is interesting dialogue. Whatever decisions were made subsequently around this, then it is what it is. But no, we have not exercised that. I mean, if it's something that is a clear error and you got money you're not entitled to, and that's documented in my file, I don't know that I can then just say I'm going to ignore the fact that that's an error and the money's due back. Because if anybody looks behind me, then I've just caused a problem for the state of Texas. I don't think that's good.
Well, I can testify that the federal government has sent me back checks that I had to then send back to them. So with the IRS, if it's not your money, you got to give it back.
Well, certainly, I do appreciate Mr. Wilson's comments. And, at the end of the day, I think all of the provider groups would appreciate, more opportunity to work with the OIG in partnership, because at the end of the day, I really do believe that providers want to do it right. I do want to say and give or acknowledge something that recently happened. I just kind of happened upon it, but it was on your website, and looking through your website, and recently they published on their website a lot of very, very helpful information to providers. What is fraud? What is waste? What is abuse? And I have not seen that kind of information, really in that level of detail. I think it was recently posted sometime in maybe July or August. And I want to say that is invaluable information to the provider community. So, as a method by really attacking fraud and abuse, two-prong issue. It's not just going after, fraud and abuse, but there's also a very, very important educational component working with the provider community, let's identify what we consider fraud, waste, and abuse. How can we help you mitigate the possibility of billing errors? What is it that we look for? What are the things that trigger an investigation? So there's just so much opportunity to get out there and truly be partners with the provider community, I think, in such a way that you could really have a good effect on the issues related to fraud and abuse. And so from that standpoint, I do want to acknowledge that information was recently posted and very much appreciated by the folks I represent.
Members, any other questions?
No.
Thank you.